Hey, this is Larry Miller, professor and director of the music business program at NYU Steinhardt and host of the Musonomics podcast. But right now, you're listening to the Your Morning Coffee podcast with my friends Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart, weekly music news for the new music business.
From Larry Miller and Musonomics, how streaming has impacted the value of music.
From Dan Runcie at Trapital, introducing The Culture Report.
And from our good friend Will Page, the global value of music copyrights jumps 18% to a record high of $39.6 billion in 2021. Could it have been even higher? Well, Jay, we're talking money today. I'm talking money today. Yes, let's get going. There's so many things we got to talk about. We got a bunch of cool audio drops. Man, I am excited. So thanks for everyone that's here with us right now, because Jay and I are going to get ready to start the podcast right now.
Stand by for transmission.
This is London calling.
Wake up! The revolution is at hand! Your morning coffee is on the air.
Standing by.
Your morning coffee, the weekly music news for the new music business. It's the highly curated, agitated, advocated, moderated, and liberated digital music information that you need to know. We are your digital music authority. And now from our studios in Hollywood, California, here's your hosts, Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart.
Jay, so good to see you, brother. On a Sunday, your Minnesota Vikings are killing it, 7-1.
They squeaked through a win today, and
A win
your
is a
Rams
win.
Are playing. Yeah, right. Yeah, your Rams are playing right now, so go Rams. How about that intro from Larry Miller?
Or
Holy
should we
cow.
say Professor Larry Miller?
We're going to talk about Larry in a minute. Our first piece is from Larry Miller, and it's a good one. But before we get into that, you and I talk about mental health
Yes,
a
we do.
lot.
Mm-hmm.
And last Friday, there was a documentary that was released. It's Selena Gomez called My Mind and Me. It's on Apple TV Plus. And I love documentaries. I know you do too.
Yes, I
and
do.
this one was so well done because she's been through so much. This is follows her through a 6-year period, and she was struggling with not only fame, but the physical and psychological struggles and diagnosis with lupus and a kidney transplant and just pain, anxiety, depression, and on top of all of that, diagnosed as bipolar.
Mm-hmm.
So. And you see all of this. The trailer came out October 10th, which is World Mental Health Day. And, I put it in my calendar. And as soon as I could watch it, I watched it. And it's just a phenomenal documentary. It was directed by Alec Kashishian. He directed Selena's Hand to Myself music video. But if you get a chance, check out Selena Gomez, My Mind and Me on Apple TV.
Well, and it
Apple
is
TV
a
Plus.
good thing. It is a good thing that these conversations are continue to be had and are being had and talked about openly. It's that is, and when you get to a certain age, you can reflect back and you remember when it wasn't the case. And
yeah, there was a stigma attached to it.
There's a stigma, absolutely. And now, knowing what I know now, having read so much, I'm quite sure my late mother had really substantial anxiety and lots of issues like that. And at the time, it was just first of all, you did. Lots of people didn't talk about it. They didn't tell their doctor about it. But even if you did, there were so few tools with which they could help you with so few medications, and it's just it wasn't acknowledged out in the open.
It was not openly discussed. And last week, you and I talked about a story by Ryan Dusick. He was one of the founding members of Maroon 5. And there was a story that he wrote that we covered. And then I spoke with him this last week because he's got this new book coming out in a week or so. It's called Harder to Breathe, a memoir of making Maroon 5, losing it all, and finding recovery. So again, that comes out November 15th. And I had a chance to talk to Ryan about that book. I asked him about his journey, and this is what he said. Ryan, thanks so much for joining me. You were a founding member of Maroon 5. You're an associate marriage and family therapist. You've written a book titled Harder to Breathe, a memoir of making Maroon 5, losing it all, and finding recovery. That comes out November 15th. Wow. Tell me about that journey.
This book has been a long time coming. It kind of is the culmination of a very long journey for me that started long before we started the band Maroon 5. Looking back and understanding now that I suffered from anxiety and things that I didn't really have really any understanding at a certain age of what it was that I was dealing with until it became a real issue when I was touring with the band. I was having physical problems, and I can recognize now I was having, mental health issues as well that contributed to this breakdown that led to me leaving the band and falling into a depression and alcoholism for about a decade, which also contributed to my anxiety becoming worse and worse over time until I really hit a bottom spiritually that led to this new journey in the last 6.5 years of recovery, going back to school and getting a master's in clinical psychology, becoming a therapist, and now writing a book and putting it out in hopes of, inspiring some people that are still struggling to find some hope in recovery and to hopefully relate to my journey and see themselves in it and the possibility of recovery.
Wow. Yeah. God bless him, for coming out on the other side. Because that would have crushed a lot of, especially, we've been around musicians. We are musicians. We've all had that goal to make it, whatever make it means. And to make it to the top, and then oftentimes, this happens in life frequently as well. You get to the top and you realize, okay, this wasn't exactly what I thought it would be like. But he, as we talked about it last week, when you get on that machine and you start making it, and you start, there's this, everybody that surrounds you has this feeling like if we don't hit the pedal to the metal and do anything and everything, we may lose this momentum. And it puts tremendous pressure on the artists. Yeah. Tremendous pressure.
Yeah, and kudos to Ryan for coming out on the other end, because he's helping other people that are in that situation. And it has been challenging with the pandemic and with streaming and the lack of revenue that we were typically used to, in the music industry. There's a lot going on, but it's people like Ryan who are talking about it and making a difference. So again, the book is coming out November 15th. Can't wait to read it. Harder to Breathe. Really looking forward to that.
And God, I love that song when it came out.
Yeah.
I remember hearing that on the radio and going, who is this? That is just, it just had that great, great song.
Right.
Yeah. By the way, I also want to mention, if you're not if you don't get the emails from Daily Variety, it's a worthwhile thing to sign up for. There's a fantastic interview with Jimmy Iovine. I think it's by Jim Oswald, as a matter of fact. I don't have it up on my computer. But Jimmy's getting inducted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame this weekend, I believe. And so I think the article says that he has said this is his last kind of music industry interview that he's going to do. We'll see about that. But oh boy, it's a really interesting article, really interesting. And you and I, we're certainly in his orbit a little bit there at our former job at Universal.
That's right.
And certainly I was in a few meetings with him and kind of saw how he operated. And, people forget, this is a guy who started his career literally sweeping the studio. You know, and then slowly, and his first gig was being a second engineer on a John Lennon record. It's like, wow, And so this is a guy who started in the studio, started engineering, and then producing, and then did a left turn and decided he wanted to start a record company, and then did another left turn and wanted to get in the consumer electronics business. So really interesting path, and it's a great article. So highly recommended. It's in your email box if you subscribe to Daily Variety.
Yeah, and if not, we should put the link in our show notes.
I'll do that. I will do that for sure.
For sure.
So, by the way, the guy that I talked to, if you don't know by now, he is none other than major Vikings fan, Jay Gilbert. He is the music industry consultant. He's the curator of the wonderful weekly Your Morning Coffee newsletter, and a former executive with Universal Music, Sony Music, Warner Music Groups, and Fox Home Entertainment. And just a pleasant human.
Oh, thank you so much, Mike. And this guy sitting across from me, one of my favorite people on this planet, Mike Etchart, longtime host of Sound and Vision Radio, formerly of SST Records, Warner Music, Capital EMI, and Universal Music Groups. And we can get together for lunch and literally talk for hours about albums and artists and documentaries and instruments and just everything. So we had a recent lunch not too long ago with Shirley Halperin, but we need to correct that and get together soon.
Yeah, and we did with Gigi Jones.
Oh, the Music Tectonics.
Just last week. So you've already
As
forgotten
soon we
me,
forget.
Sonny. That's right.
They say that memory is the second thing to go.
I can't remember what the first is.
But thank you very much.
He's here all week. And hey, while we're at it, Jay, we must, of course, give a shout out to the great folks that help us put this show together, including our good friends at Bandzoogle. The Your Morning Coffee podcast is brought to you by our groovy friends at Bandzoogle. Built by musicians for musicians, Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform that makes it easy to build a beautiful website and EPK for your music. All the features you need for a professional website are already built in, including hosting and a custom domain name, dozens of fully customizable design templates, tools to sell your music and merch commission-free crowdfunding and fan subscription features, mailing list tools to grow your fan list and send newsletters, social media integrations, and live support from their musician-friendly team 7 days a week. Your Morning Coffee podcast listeners can go over to bandzoogle.com and try it free for 30 days. Just use the promo code MORNINGCOFFEE, all one word, to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. That's bandzoogle.com, promo code MORNINGCOFFEE.
Love Bandzoogle. We're also brought to you by Hypebot. Since 2004, Hypebot has chronicled the new music business and the trends and technologies that are changing how music is discovered, consumed, marketed, and monetized. Edited daily by founder Bruce Houghton with help from Alana Bonilla, Hypebot and sister blog Music Think Tank are published by live music and discovery and marketing platform Bands in Town. That's easy for you to say.
Easy for you to say. Hey, how about Bands in Town? Over 74 million. That's right. 74 million live music fans trust Bands in Town to get personalized concert alerts, recommendations, and messages from their favorite artists. It's the #1 artist service platform, connecting over 560,000 artists with their super fans. Managers, labels, agencies, and artists access their own dashboard to manage and promote their tour dates across all platforms. Bands in Town.
Yeah, and finally, the Music Business Association and the Music Biz Conference. For more than 6 decades, the Music Biz Conference has been the point of origin for inspiration and collaboration in the music business. Join us in Nashville, May 15th through the 18th. I'll be attending. By the way, Mike, I looked it up. I've been attending NARM/Music Biz Conference now for 30 years. Wow.
But again, you were 2 at the first one. So
my mom took me.
Absolutely. Yeah. This is nothing about the age of you. So
thank you.
Yeah, I'm impressed.
You got my back. Thank you.
Yes.
Appreciate it.
Yes, indeed. Well, big thanks to the Music Business Association, Bandzoogle, Hypebot, and Bands in Town. Boy, we really, really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And Jay, what do we say? And by the way, I'm kind of mad because last night I went into my local Shell station specifically asking for a winning lottery ticket.
Oh, maybe they misunderstood what you said.
I think they must have, because I spent $20 and none of them won the Powerball.
I read a story about this. I don't really follow it that closely, but was it like $1.5 billion or something?
It was. I think it was more than that. It was like 1.6 or something, but nobody won, and so I'm going to give them a second.
So now
chance
it's more.
Yeah, it's going to be, which I think is Monday
Okay.
night. Yeah, so it's going to be more. They say it's going to be 1.9 billion.
It's only money.
It's only money, but I was already like planning what I was going to do on Monday instead of going to work. But
Well, you have to adjust your plans.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. All right, let's talk about the first one. We talked about Larry Miller and his Musonomics. I hope he's copyrighted that name, because calling it Musonomics
It's great.
is great.
Yeah.
It's great. But his piece, How Streaming Has Impacted the Value of Music. And man, what a detailed and fascinating article. It's remarkable.
It's really a great paper. And if you didn't catch what he said during the intro, he's the professor and director of the music business program at NYU Steinhardt and host of the Musonomics podcast. And I listened to a couple of episodes this week. I don't know how that slipped by me. So I'm hanging my head in shame that I missed. I'm going to have to catch up on all these. But one in particular, I listened to this episode on neighboring rights. And it finally, someone could explain, because a lot of this stuff is complicated and it's nuanced, and you need someone to walk you through what it means. And my hat's off to Larry for that particular episode, but I'll be catching up, binging on the rest on my morning walks. But I highly recommend the Musonomics podcast. But he's released this paper that you've talked about. Let's dig in.
Yeah, so it starts with the executive summary, which, like every great paper does, which I always gravitate towards. And having prepared a number of documents, as I know you have over the years, I also know that that's really all anybody ever reads sometimes. However, this thing is worth really digging in deep to, because there's such an amazing amount of really interesting information. But
absolutely,
as it starts, he says the transition over the last decade from purchases of CDs, vinyl albums, and downloads to subscription and advertising-supported streaming has had an enormous economic impact on the music industry. And in this report, he says we set out to quantify this impact, focusing on number one, the dramatic increase in NPS, that's net publishers' share multiples paid by purchasers of music copyrights. Number two is the increased interest in music royalties as an investment opportunity. Boy, that's something we have certainly talked about a lot for the last 2 years. Number three, the reduction and even reversal of the traditional decay curve for music releases. And number four, the increased resiliency of the music industry at large on both a macro and micro level.
Well, let's talk about a couple of these points, and we'll dig into his report a little bit. But, when you talk about this investment into intellectual property, and we've seen a lot of this with Hypnosis and KKR and BMG and Primary Wave and all of these different artists that are selling either the publishing or the masters or both that they control. And I think a lot of it has to do with we've got this predictability now that we never really had in the music industry. And if you look at some of these people who are predicting the future, people like Goldman Sachs, a lot of people refer to their estimates of where streaming's going in the next decade or so. And of course, Mark Mulligan over at Music Business Worldwide has a really great kind of counter to that, which may be a little bit more optimistic. But I think that there are a lot of reasons to be very positive about some of these things, although I've been reading that's slowing down just in the number of some of the larger deals, but it doesn't mean that that's going away, because it's still a pretty good investment for these folks.
Right. And, a lot of these things we're going to talk about today covers certainly recorded music, but also publishing. And you and I have talked a number of times about, in our era in the music business, even though we worked for major labels that had major publishing companies, they were the guys in that other office. And, when we were focused in our early careers, and most of my career for sure, on recorded music and not publishing. And so this is my awareness and knowledge of publishing, because publishing goes back well more than 100 years.
Sure.
And so talking about those two things together, I find, just from my own knowledge base, is really helpful, because publishing is massive, and it's changing as well. And all boats rise, as they say, when we have success. And so as these streaming service, as the streaming business has completely changed the models that we now talk about, the publishers are mentioned hand in hand with the recorded music companies. I find that super, super interesting.
Well, people are learning more about publishing, and it's thanks to the news. When you're talking about the Copyright Royalty Board and the Music Modernization Act, I think there's a really nice trend to get songwriters paid more fairly. And you and I interviewed Merck Mercuriadis and had a very long and amazing conversation about that topic, about they're the lifeblood of this industry, and yet they're the least paid. I'd love to kind of walk through some of the key findings that Larry has in this report. I'll kick off the first one. Streaming is responsible for increasing the economic value of music. Okay, yeah, we know that, but I think it's impressive. Larry calls out that streaming contributed 61.5% to the value of music transactions in 2021. We reached this conclusion by calculating its impact on the rise of NPS, there it is again, and multiples paid for music catalogs in recent transactions.
Right. And as you said just a couple of minutes ago, his second key finding is streaming economics attracts music industry investment. He says the consistent and, to a degree, predictable revenue streams that streaming generates is largely responsible for the increased investment activity around music royalties and catalogs, as well as record labels exploring public markets. And that really is a dramatic change from, call it, the old music business.
Yeah. As well as, this consumption of streaming and how that has been adopted by so many people. Because you and I, when we worked together, a decade ago, we were talking about this celestial jukebox, and now that it's become this reality, there's so much more revenue coming from that. And then, of course, he's talking about some of these catalogs. The third point is that streaming has made the music industry more resilient. The streaming model has helped the music industry withstand disruptions caused by external forces. During the pandemic, when nearly every other meaningful source of music industry revenue fell, like touring and merch and all of those things, streaming revenues actually grew.
Absolutely. As he also says, streaming reduces the revenue decay curve. I feel like I'm in college, Jay. Well, I sort of am when he's a college professor. He's explaining this stuff. He says, it's normal for revenues to fall following the prime earning window of new releases. Revenues derived from streaming tend to fall to a consistent level and maintain as a percentage of overall earnings. That's really interesting.
It is, and it has to do with the next point as well. But we talk about how much catalog plays into the new music business. It's a majority of the business. Now, you and I have had the discussion, should it be 18 months or older? Will Page has some interesting points about it as well. The next point, streaming has increased the longevity of catalog music. And I think those 2 points go hand in hand. The top 5.2% of the 500 best performing albums released in 2018 performed better in their second 18 months following initial release than they did in their first 18 months. So that's considered catalog. Yes. And you and I have debated this a little bit. Should it be based on velocity instead of an 18-month thing? Should there be... I don't know. It's really interesting to take a look at how not only is catalog 18 months or older, and that's, could be a Dua Lipa or Adele or something, but also some of these viral things that happen with, Fleetwood Mac and the Ocean Spray thing, and that blows that thing up, or, TikTok and some of these short form video platforms can really make a difference. We reported on Ghost, the band Ghost, had a track that wasn't from their new album Impera. It was prior to that, called Mary on a Cross. And because of the activity on TikTok, couple weeks ago, it landed on the Billboard Hot 100.
Wow.
So, yeah.
It's amazing. He also mentioned streaming services face both a dual mandate and historically low profit margins. He says streaming services face many cost pressures from the cost of licensing the music streamed. These services compete based not on the music catalog, which they all share, but on the quality of user experience. So, but again, the low profit margins, we've talked a lot about this. It's like, well, yeah, but you are using the content to build your business. And so no
and hold that thought
complaint.
on profit margins, because there's a real interesting chart coming up in one of the pieces we're going to cover about profit margin. So hold on to that. But before we move forward, I love that Larry put in some historical context here.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting. He says the music industry has experienced many format shifts over the years. We've seen it, right? Notable shifts in revenue, profits, investment activity. When we went from, vinyl and cassette to CD, and, CD to digital download, and then download to streaming. So that's absolutely correct. The most notable format shift in recent memory is a transition from physical to digital distribution. The impact on the economic value of music from this shift was both immediate and staggering. Initially, the technology rapidly got ahead of the business model. And I think that's really key.
Yes.
And I haven't heard anybody really say it quite like that. And I thought this was brilliantly put. And I'll do it one more time. Initially, the technology rapidly got ahead of the business model, resulting in an epidemic of unregulated piracy that generated no income for anyone involved in the creation of music. It nearly destroyed the industry, but it also revealed the path forward into our digital future.
That's right.
I love that context, that, how he set this up.
Right. And we were in the trenches when this was all going down, and when we were at Universal, and we saw the just staggering decline. And I was not there for the rebound, but it rebounded. But I don't remember at the time really being that confident or necessarily seeing exactly how it would shake out. I remember thinking, okay, I can, you see parts of it, but you're kind of looking through the mist.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, how is this going to end up? And yeah, it did end up well. But I remember thinking at the time, I don't quite see the future. I don't see how it's going to land.
We didn't know that it was going to that streaming was actually going to work. We didn't believe, I think a lot of people didn't believe, that people would actually pay a subscription.
Right.
They would want ownership. By the way, I made a mistake. Let me correct that. The kind of graph about gross margin, profit margin, is in this piece. Larry put this in there. Sorry, Larry. It wasn't Will Page. And it's interesting because he examines gross margins earned by different types of company in the music business. So Spotify's gross margin, about 27%. Spotify ad-supported, this surprised me a little bit, is only 10% profit margin, gross margin. Warner Music Group and UMG, for example, their average gross margin is 48%. And if you look back in history and look at like Tower Records, that was like 31%. So we hear this all the time, that, streaming isn't fair to artists. And I've heard people say to me, well, Spotify doesn't pay artists enough. Well, Spotify doesn't pay the artist. They pay the rights holder.
Yeah, right.
And, if you're the rights holder, then, you're typically paying a royalty to the artist. And then we talk about co-writes, and the average number of co-writes, at least on a story we reported recently, was north of 5. And of course, there has to be an asterisk there, because sometimes that's because they're using loops and beats that are from somebody, so it's not necessarily 5 or 10 people in the room. But I'd really like to take a look at this this part he has here called streaming slice of the pie. Do you see that?
Yeah, which page is it on? I think
It's right by that chart on average gross margin. Let me see. It's on page 10.
Page 10?
And I'll kick it off while you're getting to page 10. Under streaming slice of the pie, Larry states that it's clear that the streaming format is where the vast bulk of music engagement takes place today. It's the format that fans use, and it's the format that now contributes the most royalties over the longest period of time. But it's also worth noting that the companies providing the streaming service do so at the slimmest of profit margins. And that's some we just talked about.
Yeah.
Particularly when looked at both historical context and compared to other players in the value chain.
But you know what? It's interesting. So, totally unrelated to music, here in Southern California, there's a proposed merger of some grocery stores.
Right.
And you look at, so as I'm looking at this, so we got Spotify Premium, their average gross margin, 27%. You mentioned that. Warner Music Group is 48%. Tower Records, 31%. It's a status bankruptcy. But when you talk about like the grocery business, their average gross margins are in the single digits.
No kidding.
Oh yeah, the margins on groceries are really slim.
Well, same with gas. You know, we talked to Glenn Peoples from Billboard, and he uses that analogy all the time, or at least that comparison, that these gasoline, these stations make 1.4% on gas. They make their money from that Coke that you buy. And the junk food or whatnot.
Of course. But if I look at this, the Spotify Premium with a gross margin of 27%, to me, that's pretty darn good. And I don't really want to hear complaining from Spotify about how, the cost of licensing all this music. I think that to me seems like a really pretty healthy gross margin. I don't know. I mean, I don't know other businesses, but as I said, again, this sort of merger that they're proposing of the grocery stores, those guys are really slim margins. So yeah, I don't know. We'll see. But that doesn't seem bad to me.
Yeah. I mean, but conversely, I think that, Spotify, and we'll use them as an example because they're kind of the popular one, although you and I both know that more music is streamed through YouTube. But they're paying out, a majority of the revenue that they take in to rights holders,
right.
and like north of 70%, they're paying out. So while you and I both believe that the songwriters should be paid more, I think we really need to take a look at, how big that slice is. You and I talked about last week all these DSPs that are now raising prices. And as much as I don't want to pay more money, I think that's a good thing because I believe that they're underpriced. Anyway, getting back to this report, I think that it's such a great report, and it's so dense and deep. There's so many different areas and great charts and graphs so you can visually see what it's all about. I highly encourage you. There's a link to this in your morning coffee, the newsletter. Definitely grab this report. Take a look at it. Go through each one of these areas because you'll learn a lot. This stuff is evolving as we're having this conversation.
Absolutely, it is a college level course and it's fascinating. So highly recommended to check.
You know what? You know what we forgot though is that I forgot that I had a conversation with Larry this last week, a great conversation with him about this report. And I got so, interested in telling you and talking to you about this report that I almost forgot. So this last week, I spoke with Larry Miller about this report, and this is what he had to say.
All right.
Larry, thanks for joining me. How did this report come about, and what were some interesting takeaways that you found?
I've been writing about one of the major trends that are driving value creation in the modern music industry now for a number of years. And one area of focus that I've been writing quite a lot about is how labels create value in the modern world when it has become optional now for, let's just call it the better part of a generation, to have to sign with a label. And so to explain to an investor or a civilian or say anybody on Capitol Hill making policy about the music industry that will affect, music creators, it's important to be able to answer questions like that. Like, well, when you don't have to sign with a label anymore, what do labels actually do? So I've been writing a fair amount about that over the last several years, and often getting involved in CRB testimony, when we periodically have to, arm up and go out and explain, why the rates should be higher for music creators across the board. But one of the things that I'd been thinking about and hadn't really taken the time to sit down and do in an organized fashion was to take a look at streaming and how do we measure the economic impact of streaming in a world where we know every year for the last at least decade how fast streaming is growing. We can measure it by the number of subscribers to the major platforms. We can measure it in terms of revenue by source for both record companies and music publishers. We can track it that way. And we know that the growth of streaming over the last decade has really only moved in one direction, right? Over what's really been a 10 or so year period. We also know that in recent years, especially over the last, let's call it 3 to 5 years, that there has been just a tremendous influx of new capital buying music catalogs, buckets of music rights, either on the music publishing side or on the label side, or in some cases, both. And sometimes that money is being spent by the incumbents, the major record companies and publishers, or the well-capitalized independents. Other times it's through very large Wall Street private equity hedge fund players, even sovereign wealth funds from other parts of the world who have invested, many billions of dollars now in the music industry. And in fact, last year alone, there were $6.5 billion of transactions that were in the hopper, of which a little over $5.5 billion actually closed. So we know that. We also know the headlines, that the multiples, the revenue multiples, whether we're talking about net publisher share, NPS on the publishing side, or net label share, if it's a label deal, have also been increasing, especially for the superstar acts that generate the most headlines, but that multiples have really gone up a lot. And although we know, viscerally, that streaming growth has everything to do with the growth in the multiples that sophisticated buyers have been willing to pay for music-related assets, we weren't really able to figure out how to demonstrate causation. I mean, it, right? Streaming is going up. Streaming is now 84% of recorded music revenue. There are all sorts of knock-on effects on music publishing that we understand. And we get all that stuff up from 2% back in, call it 2011, 2012, that year before Spotify entered the US market and most other developed markets around the world. So what we wanted to do in this report was a few things. One was to develop a rigorous analytical way of thinking about how streaming caused values to go up. And so I would say that, headline finding number one here is that for last year, 2021, just looking at the music publishing side, that because it's an easier way to think about revenue impact than recorded music, which is, which has, some different factors that drive recorded music revenue. And, publishing has, many sources that comprise publishing revenue, some of which is streaming related and much of which is not, especially on the public performance side, where radio and general licensing and television and cable are still such important revenue drivers. But to be able to isolate streaming's impact on music publishing required being able to come up with a defensible way to model streaming's impact on the growth in NPS valuations. And without getting into the super boring granular detail of how we did that, we were able to explain how and why streaming for just last year alone comprised 61.5%, just under 62% of value growth in the music publishing business. A couple of the other things that we wanted to do while doing that was to take a holistic look, including updating really some of the best and most important work that had come out in the several years previous to that. And you may remember that our friend Will Page did a really important piece back in 2017 about how catalog, the definition of how we think about music catalog, was probably going to have to change. And he did this deep dive on Imagine Dragons was the case that he studied in that report. And I had a strong hunch that there were many records that did better in recent years in their second 18 months of release than their first 18 months of release, which sort of flies in the face of conventional catalog definition. And so we were able to engage Luminate to look at all of the records, all of the albums that charted in 2018. And we had to go back to 2018 because we needed 3 years of data, the first 18 months and the second 18 months. And what we saw was that something over 5%, it was about 5.2% of the albums that hit the chart in 2018 did better in the second 18 months than in the first. So it's not every record, but we also noticed that the shape of the decay curve was changing and that records are hanging around longer. And it's not like they're generating all of the income that they're ever going to generate in the first year or 18 months of release, like the way it used to be for most records, and that records had a much longer earning potential as a result of the way that people are discovering and consuming music now due to streaming.
Awesome. That's great.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Well,
a lot to learn.
A lot to learn and a lot to pay attention to. And this stuff is there's so much to know, so much to kind of process and digest. But we got to do it. So
you need someone like Larry to kind of break it down into English, so we, us knuckleheads can kind of highlight the report and learn from it. And before we move on to this next piece, if you haven't listened already, go check out Musonomics, the podcast. It's absolutely phenomenal.
And we think that Larry has to have had on mic experience in radio.
Yeah, I mean it's too good.
Yeah, that's what we're guessing. The next one, speaking of reports, this is from our friend Dan Runcie at Trapital. It's introducing the culture report. Excuse me, let me get the marbles out of my mouth. And we also had a conversation with Dan Runcie.
Yeah, when I saw this report, what I loved about it is that it wasn't just data and insights, although I love that stuff. It's what does it all mean? And if you don't know who Dan Runcie is, we talk about him on this podcast a lot. He created and runs the Trapital newsletter and podcast, which is an industry leader in the world of hip hop. So he came out with this report. It's called the Culture Report. And yes, you're right. I had a chance to talk with Dan. So this is what Dan tells us about the report. Let's listen in.
What I do like about this, Jay, is that, again, you've got data, you've got numbers, but he's putting it also in sort of a context
Yes.
About the growth of genres and about the global reach of genres and things like that. So it's a different, interesting perspective of analyzing data. Quite frankly.
I love it. I absolutely love it. And you and I, let's go through the topics that he covers in this report. But before we do, the introduction to this report, Dan states that this is Trapital's first ever culture report. This is your breakdown on important annual trends in music, media, and of course, culture. This report is a collection of data, insights, and interviews from industry experts on various trends. They did this in conjunction with Dice, which is a ticketing company that's really trying to offer a fair ticketing experience. And he credits Russ Tannen, who's the president of Dice. But let's talk about some of the things. If you read this report, and we highly encourage you to download this report. Again, it's in your morning coffee this last week. Let's talk about what topics are covered.
Sure. He starts with, where does hip hop go next? He starts with saying in the streaming era, hip hop's growth has been on the rise. In 2018, it became in the U.S., it was the most popular genre of music. He says hip hop is still on top and its revenues are still growing, but after nearly a decade of market share growth, hip hop's share of total revenue has declined. And he mentions that in 2020, the total revenue was $2.7 billion. The share of total revenue was 28.2%. Although it went up to $2.7 billion in 2021, that share of total revenue actually dropped 27.7%.
Right, and he mentions that in the audio a little bit. And just to kind of put a fine point on it, there's reasons for that slight decline, and really, while pop, rock, country, dance, they've maintained their market share, Latin music has grown the most from hip hop's share. And he mentions that it has to do with, or it could be partly to do with how they're categorized.
Right.
And you and I talked about this before we hit record, like Bad Bunny that's hip hop, but it's listed as Latin music.
Yes.
So just by classifying things and as he spoke about, rule changes with bundles or, the vinyl supply chain issues. There's a lot of issues for that. And it's not like dropping off the face of the planet or anything, but there was a slight decline, but there's a lot of reasons for it.
Yeah, exactly. And including a lot of things, like he says, early mover advantages don't last forever. American hip hop artists and their fans are always early on new platforms, from MySpace Music to YouTube, ringtones to streaming, the list goes on. Other genres followed hip hop's lead on streaming, which ate into its share. So, there's a lot of these things that he mentions are kind of like, they're not dramatic things, but when you add them all together, it can kind of point to that kind of decline we were referring to.
Yeah. Let's talk about a couple of these. I mean, we could spend all day, but what I'd really like to do is cover the topics. I'll take the first 6, maybe you take the next
Sure.
6, and we can dig into a couple of these. We talked about where does hip hop go next. Rap's capital spreads the wealth. Live music bounces back. The power laws of streaming. Millionaires selling music. Billionaires selling product.
I love that one. Millionaires selling music, billionaires selling products.
Yeah.
Even though that's out of order, I want to take that one because he says the culture's wealthiest artists use their music influence to build companies that sell products that consumers want to buy. Time and time again. So he's talking about product sales from artists like Rihanna, Diddy, Jay-Z, Dr. Dre, Ye, the investing from Nas and Snoop Dogg and Chamillionaire, live performances, of course, by Beyonce, Drake, Kendrick Lamar, Travis Scott, TV and film from artists that are now actors, brand partnerships, music revenue streaming, all of these things and all of these categories are well over $1 billion when you talk about net worth. So you've got this leverage, basically, artists leveraging in hip hop in pretty dramatic ways. So it's it's interesting to see it in a chart like this with, by investing, you've got these particular performers, by TV and film, you've got these other performers. It's pretty remarkable, actually. And I think that's also a testament to artists' concepts these days of basically music is one thing that they do, but they do lots and lots of other things. And using that music talent and skill and success and popularity to leverage other things is something that really is this generation's, and you see it very predominantly in hip hop. It's pretty remarkable.
I'm not a businessman. I'm a businessman. He talks about rap's capital spreads the wealth. And, I had heard that the southern states were a bit more popular for hip hop, but I didn't know it was as dramatic until I saw his chart that he puts in here. Atlanta has yet to give up its crown, but it's starting to spread the wealth, he says. Its share of artists on the Spotify charts has declined. And he has it broken up by East Coast, Midwest, South, and West Coast. And even though it's declined over the last few years, man, the South is just a beast, when it comes to hip hop. So just one of the many topics that he covers in here. And we should hit a few of the others before we move further down. TikTok is the new MTV. Pay me in equity. Investing in music startups. NFTs are best for established acts. Investing in women in hip hop, and he has a whole section about the people who listen to hip hop. And I mean, we can't go through every single one of these. We're just going to go through a few of these to give you a sense of what this report's all about. But I see a lot of these reports like from RIAA, IFPI, and they just have some charts and a few basic facts. This takes each one of those and really tells you what it means.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like Larry's. This is an unbelievably worthwhile download to read and check out. And I just tip my hat to Dan and his team, because it's beautifully researched, beautifully laid out, and very much worth your time to check it out. There's a lot of data in it, and it's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So. Check it out, Dan Runcie. We tip our hat, brother, to that hard work and that kind of that perspective on this for this particular report. It's great.
Yeah, and if you don't already subscribe to Trapital, check out the newsletter. Check out the podcast. It's world-class stuff.
And if those two reports aren't enough for you, the last one, Jay, from our good friend Will Page, the global value of music copyrights jumps 18%. To a record high of $39.6 billion in 2021. But he asks, could it have been even higher? And again, another economics. I feel like I'm back in college when I start reading these things. Oh my God, it's remarkable stuff. And of course, his book Tarzan Economics is really the Bible for this stuff.
And we've raved about that on this podcast. We had him celebrate our 100th episode by doing an interview. Will is very smart. He's hilarious. And
he's got a great sense of humor.
I love the way he writes. There's a little sass involved in here.
Yes.
But I think he's hinting, could that number have been higher? I think absolutely it could have been. Yes. I mean, even if you just look at vinyl, if we could have actually fulfilled vinyl orders over the last 2 years, who knows? I've had people say that it could have been 20, 25% higher. And I think that's a conservative estimate.
And he did some really kind of forensic I'm stumbling on my words. He did a lot of forensic research going back to 2001, which he says is the earliest data available, and he's talking about kind of the value of these copyrights, and it's really fascinating. He said that year the global value of recorded music was $28.3 billion. Interestingly enough, of that amount of money, that pie, just 23% went to publishing. Here we are talking about publishing again, and the difference between the two industries and how much of that pie they collect. on up to today, that 39.6 billion, and we've got the publishers coming in at 34% of that number in 2021, which is the most recent year for information. So as he says, the great news is the value of copyrights keeps on growing, and yes, and which of course is why we see all of these catalogs being sold and all that stuff. People are paying attention to this. Wall Street is paying attention to these numbers, and they're going in the right direction, which is why we are where we are.
Yeah, it's a thing. He states in this report that the whole purpose, really remains the same. Whether you're investing, operating, or earning from music copyrights, you ought to know how much it's all worth and how each piece of the puzzle is trending. That's so important. This year, we not only have a really big figure to digest, but big improvements in methodology. He talks about SISAC, for example, has removed U.S. digital mechanical rights income and helpfully revised all prior years for consistency because they recently formed, the MLC, the Mechanical Licensing Collective, and that is not a SISAC member. So there is so much in this report. It reminds me a little bit, even though it's a totally different kind of take on the business, of what Larry Miller's put together. This is different, but there's a lot to it, and I highly recommend that you print it out. And I know that's old school, but as you read through it, kind of highlight certain things that are important to you.
Yeah. And this week's episode, and for sure a lot of the things in the newsletter are really kind of, they're dense and but they're really important to kind of absorb as best you can. And a lot of the stuff I have to read twice, to be honest, and sometimes 3 times to just get my head around it. And
and a lot of it is just about fairness. Will says in this piece, talking about fairness, at face value, copyrights have never been worth this much. He says in his recent publication, Global Value of Music Copyright is Bigger Now Than It's Ever Been. He says he was able to back out a figure for 2001. Oh, that's what you just talked about, that earliest data that was available.
Yes.
And, that year, global value of recorded music, $28.3 billion. And he has some really great charts. I realize you just kind of covered some of this, but he has these really great charts that show visually kind of the pie and how it's growing. And then the last thing I'll kind of say on this section is that he says that, the great news is that the value of copyright, keeps on growing. Nostalgia has long been the biggest enemy of the music industry, a misplaced belief that we need to get back to the good old days when record labels used to sell CDs to stores by the weight of pallet. Nostalgia can mislead and misinform. Music copyright has never had it so good.
Right. Well, and it's we talk a lot about do the artists have it so good? And in some ways they actually do. But in other ways they do not. But boy, when you look at it from a business perspective, and it was interesting on one of these charts in here, where we talked about that number in 2001, and then you see the overall value drop in 2014 from 2001. So 2001 was 28.3 billion. But again, as we head to 2014, 25.3 billion. And far more of that was publishing, but that was kind of the beginning days of streaming. And then from 2014 to 2021 up to almost 40 billion. So you see that kind of recovery and the changing face of what the business is. And this may be the good old days, that we may be there.
Well, he talks about revenue streams that I hadn't even considered. You and I talk about things like publishing and masters and touring and merch and sync and some of these things, but there's so much more to it. The Brabeck brothers have an amazing book on monetization, but he talks about something in here I hadn't considered, and that is terms like production music and library music.
Yes.
It's in a section called royalty-free music, adding a new piece to the copyright puzzle. Publishers large and small will have a division dedicated to this form of quote unquote buyout music that can be acquired by users with an upfront payment. And we've seen this, he says new entrants like Epidemic Sounds, they've really blown up this business, offering a subscription-based model to over 35,000 royalty-free music tracks and 90,000 sound effects. And with everybody, using these DAWs, digital audio workstations, and they're recording high-quality albums at home or on the road, and there's these loops and beats and all of these things that we're talking about. It's a thing. There's a lot to it.
It is a thing, absolutely, and of course, with all the production, film and television that is going on, and they need music, and a lot of smaller budget productions don't have a lot of budget for music. These kind of catalogs that are royalty free, essentially, but they're easily licensed, and the owners have a lot of flexibility in the way they don't with other catalogs. So it's pretty interesting how those are now kind of considered, and of course that's a huge business. A good buddy of mine works over at Universal in that very division, and it's pretty amazing. He also talked about the dollar dominance, and we kind of forget because things are still, in terms of cost of goods here still pretty high, but the dollar is super strong worldwide right now against a lot of other currencies. And he says one obvious cause for concern is the economic climate, or more specifically, the strengthening U.S. dollar and its impact on this global calculation. He says,
I hadn't thought of that. I mean, as an economist, of course, he would think of it.
He does, yes. He says since January of 2021, we're seeing something of a hockey stick effect, rising from around 110 to 130 as the dollar became a safe haven for nervous investors and institutions. So, it's, again, when you talk about music and when you talk about the things that we're used to talking about in music, which is the artists and releases and chart positions and all that stuff. But now here we are talking about the global amounts of money and then the impact of currency rates and things like that. Dude, this is business stuff. It's like, this is not my core strength, if I even have a core strength, but it's fascinating to read it and check it out and see the things that somebody like Will's experience and knowledge base that they consider when they put all these reports together. It's fascinating.
Yeah. One thing I want to make sure we touch on before we go is, he talks about the U.S. share of the global recorded music business, and we know that the USA is a leader in the music industry. But in 2011, U.S. was 26% of that global business, according to the IFPI. Well, fast forward, 10 years later, and it goes from that 26% to 38%.
Yeah.
And he says that this year's, mid-year report showed the U.S. growing at an impressive 8%, meaning that the U.S. market could be worth $10 billion by the year end. That's pretty impressive.
It is. It is. Well, your homework, fellow listeners, is to go and download all three of these articles that Jay and I have talked about, and take your time because it's dense stuff. Boy, it's like reading textbooks, but we all need to expand our knowledge base. And when you talk about, it's a business, not the music art, it's the music business.
Yeah.
And it's very important. And we have all these tools at our disposal, including the great newsletter that you do and the articles and things that are contained within, including these. And boy, it's great stuff, but boy, it's dense, and I have to read a lot of these things multiple times, but fascinating.
Well, the last thing I'll say on it is that yes, you are absolutely accurate. There's a lot of information here to digest, but the beauty of these reports is that they're aesthetically pleasing and they have wonderful visuals, and you don't have to read, page after page after page.
Right.
You can everything's laid out so well that you can not only see what's in the report and read the executive summary, but then you can get kind of a visual on what is being communicated here. So don't be afraid of it. It's great stuff. Definitely go in there, pull this stuff down. It's really good stuff to have.
Well, and it's also, again, talking about the different perspectives that they all kind of approach for with data, and so it's kind of slightly different stories, which are all meaningful and interesting and thought provoking, which is what we all expect. And on that note, Jay, it's time to wrap up the episode. Thanks for listening to episode 117. Both Jay and I certainly appreciate it. We also want to thank the Music Business Association, Bandzoogle, Hypebot, and Bands in Town for rocking our world and helping us put the
We
show
appreciate
together.
it.
We do appreciate that. And of course, we appreciate you, the listener. Jay and I do not take that for granted.
Nope.
And to say we could not do it without you is absolutely quite true. We couldn't do it without you. So thanks for listening this week. We really appreciate it. And the good news is Jay and I will be back next week for episode 118. So thanks for listening. Have a wonderful week, and we will see you next time on the Your Morning Coffee podcast.
You've been listening to Your Morning Coffee, the weekly music news program for the new music business. Join Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart next time for the digital music news you need to know.